process. So we've looked at the pastors and then the founders, and now we want to look at the documents, the fruit of all these men. We've heard a lot about their faith, and I guess you could say this would be their works, what they've set in motion. This is the part of them that's still with us, our documents, that are still in action today. And this is I'd say this is some of the most important stuff to know, even more than just the character or maybe the quotes of some of the founders, to be able to defend it. And I wasn't sure what to start or what documents to go over, and I didn't want to do a whole lot of reading just because I know that can be kind of tedious for some of y'all, but I think I'm just going to stick with a few of the main documents and kind of look at some of the main parts of them and kind of what the basis is for them. I got a book here. I'm going to start off real quick. There's a book here that I actually got out of the house over there. It's called God and Government. And you've heard us talk about David Barton. And this isn't him, but it's another guy who's just got a lot of really good quotes and factual stuff about the Constitution and God's influence on it. And one thing I thought that was interesting in it, something that was said and that I thought would be good to open up with, was he quotes another book, an old book called The Institutes of Biblical Law. And he said, there's no neutral law system. Every law system is based on something, some form of right or wrong. And so therefore, he said, it must be recognized that in any culture, the source of law is the God of that society. And I believe that's what we're here to look at tonight, is our documents in our law. And you can see it'll be whatever the God of that society was during that time. And there's tell you what, one thing too before I move on. There's a really good quote by somebody that I've never heard of. I'm assuming he was a pastor. But this is extremely important to remember whenever it comes to us and our obligation as Christians to get involved in government and to run for public office, and when we are in public office to not just say, oh well, Christianity is something I do at home or in church. We should take our values all the way to the halls of Congress. He said, a Christian is just as much under obligation to obey God's will in the most secular of his daily businesses as he is in his prayer closet or at the communion table. He has no right to separate his life into two realms and acknowledge different moral codes in each respectively. God reigns over all. His will is the supreme law in all relations and actions. And it's just a silly idea that we talk. Some people believe that there shouldn't be any godliness. You shouldn't take your religion to the halls of Congress or whatever. But then we turn around and vote for people because they're a good. We vote on them for their character as a man and their godliness and he's honest and all this kind of stuff. I heard one of the Kennedys a few years ago, one of the descendants of the JFK and all that, and they were all Catholic, and he was supporting something very pro-abortion, and somebody was like, how does that conflict with you being a Catholic and your whole family being extremely Roman Catholic? And he said, well, separation of church and state, I'm not supposed to be a Catholic in Congress. And that's an absurd belief. If a Christian they believe that Christ is all in all, and I can do all things through Christ. It's just, it's irrational to think that the minute you step into Congress, you become a totally different person, and that's what it's talking about. We don't have a right to separate it and have a moral law for our personal life and then a totally different moral law for Congress or whatever we do in Congress, So it's just some of the absurdity that's been taught and people have bought into. Speaking of the source, let's get an idea for the founding era, who would have been the God of that society? You've heard a lot of quotes from the pastors and things that pastors were doing and founding fathers. I think everybody has an idea of who their God was, but about 15 years ago, I believe, the University of Houston actually did a study to see who, if you hadn't been here hearing all these quotes and everything these past couple of weeks, here's just a study to see if you didn't know anything about them. What was their God? Where was their heart at? What was their spiritual beliefs? And it took 10 years to do, but several students and faculty, they took 15,000 writings from the founding era. That would probably have encompassed about 20 to 30 years worth of just writings, and they found 3,154 direct quotes from that era. All right, and so they took them and they analyzed what was the source of that quote. And the number one cited source for all 3,000 of those was the Bible. 34% of those were direct quotes from the Bible. That's quotes in letters of correspondence to each other regarding laws and what they should do here and there, and all throughout the war, and in their state houses and ultimately the federal houses of government. This is how far ahead that was from the second source. The second source was quotes that came from a guy named Charles de Montesquieu, and that was at 8.9%. So the Bible was 4 times more than even the second most quoted source. So by far the number one source of the quotes that went into the writings of the founding era. Third was a guy named William Blackstone at 6.7%, and then fourth, you've probably heard of John Locke at 2.3%. And I'll share something real quick about two of these people, William Blackstone and John Locke, just to give you an idea. It's not like it was the Bible and then, totally different was these three men and so on. Whenever you look at some of these men and see that their education came from the Bible and their works basically cited the Bible, then it's actually more than just 34% that came from the Bible. William Blackstone, he wrote in the 1760s, he completed a huge volume that became the standard law text for the next 150 years. If you were a law student in the United States, you would have read his work. And he was just the ultimate word on American law and biblical law. And there was a law student in the 1800s who wasn't a Christian necessarily, but he went to law school. He wanted to be a lawyer. And he read the Bible in so many, he referenced the Bible in so many of William Blackstone's writings that he actually became a Christian and went on to be a pastor. He was one of the main pastors of the America's Second Great Awakening. So that seed was planted by reading the law books from William Blackstone, who was cited by the founders in that area. So you got the Bible, but William Blackstone, you could add his percentage to that, and and that guy's name was Charles Finney, by the way. And then you got John Locke. He was considered a theologian throughout his time. He lived about 100 years before the founders, and he wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And whenever it got attacked in England by a couple people, he wrote a vindication of the reasonableness of Christianity, defending his original work. Then it would get attacked again, and he actually wrote a second vindication of it. So a very staunch Christian. And a book that we'll talk about here in a minute that he wrote, one of the most important books in our founding that our founders looked to it's called The Two Treatises of Civil Government. I actually have a copy of it and hadn't. It's pretty dense reading, but I hadn't made it all the way through it. But we'll talk about that in just a second. But that gives you an idea of who the God of our society was and what was driving the basis of our law. Because whatever the God of society is, that'll determine what the law is. There's 4 organic documents that all other each state and colony had these resolutions, and each state and colony had a constitution, but you can say that the building block of all American government is 4 documents known as the 4 organic documents, and they are the Declaration of Independence, in order, chronological order: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and then you had the Northwest Ordinance, and then finally you had the Constitution. I didn't really look into the Articles of Confederation much because the Constitution ultimately replaced it. It was kind of right after the war. That's what they put together, and it had a few loopholes in it, and they tightened it up and perfected it with the Constitution. But I just kind of want to analyze some of these main ones and just maybe share a couple of things on it. The Declaration of Independence, I want to read. So the Continental Congress, they're fixing to separate from King George, and they give they give the reasons why. And just before they list a list of 27 grievances, this is what they say about government. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." And I talked about this at church camp a couple years ago. You know what an unalienable right is? What the word alienable means, or unalienable. If it's alienable, alien means it's separated, like a space alien, or when you alienate somebody, you separate. If you have rights that are unalienable, they can't be separated from you. God gave them to you, and no man can separate them from you. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. What's basically the number one purpose of government? To secure these rights. What rights? These rights that are given to us by God. That's one of the absolute number one purposes of government. And it's with the belief that God gave us those rights, and He did give us those rights. And then it goes on down to say, and since that's one of the basic purposes of government, that governments are instituted among men, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, meaning when they no longer secure your rights and rather abuse them, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. Now, there's not many things that are worth that give you the liberty to totally throw off government, but violation of your rights is one of those, and it's because the whole purpose of government is instituted to basically protect our rights, and so that and those rights are special to us because they come from God, and our founders understood that, and that has to be a deep-held belief. If you're declaring this, you're not just letting the king know, you're declaring it. It's a declaration. And he was probably the number one most powerful person on earth at that time. So to declare that, you really believe it and you're passionate about it, and it's just amazing that the belief that the Creator gave us our rights is what spawned that and the war, and then ultimately establishing a government that would secure those rights for you. I'm going to read part of the last paragraph on it. He goes down and lists a bunch of grievances of how he's been a tyrant and why they're throwing off his yoke. And he says that we're appealing to we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. Meaning they feel justified in everything they're doing by God. They're appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world. And for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So that's 4 mentions of God in the Declaration of Independence, and that was the reason for the Declaration of Independence, to protect the rights that we have that specifically God gave us. So I got to thinking this week about how the Declaration was about 12 years before, or 11 years before the Constitution, and you had the war in between those two documents. And the Declaration was official. It was not as official as the Constitution, but those ideas of separating and becoming a free nation, they had already been conceived before the Declaration, but that's where it was really set in stone. And you could kind of think of the Declaration of Independence as conception, and the nation wasn't fully formed until the Constitution, which you could really say was the birth of the nation. And so think of our nation as being conceived in righteousness in a lot of ways. It really was. I mean, from day one, there's day one, that's the birthday, which really I think of it more as a day of conception, but from day one, we were conceived in righteousness. It had to do with God and our belief in God, and you don't just stand up to the biggest tyrant on earth without a belief in God and a feeling that that you're justified through God, and that He's going to give you the strength because they had the war ahead of them. So they were, we sang "Onward, Christian Soldier." You don't just do that without a strong belief in God and a belief that God is going to bless you and that you're justified in it. So that's the Declaration of Independence. Basically, it's a very godly document, and we wouldn't have had it without a strong belief in God. Josh shared, I'd forgotten a couple of things. He shared it just before I came in here. There's 56 signers to the Declaration. 29 of them held degrees. I don't know if you'd call it a full-blown seminary degree. Maybe you would, because they went to schools that were trained, that were set up for the purpose of training ministers of the gospel. 29 of them had gone to those schools. So they were maybe not active pastors, but they had the education to go and be a pastor. And that don't include people who held positions in church or who attended church, very faithfully. But 29, that's over half of them. And a lot of those schools were schools like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Dartmouth. All those Ivy League schools were set up by, think about where they are. They're all in New England, those earliest colonies, and some of those schools are over 300 years old. They're older than the United States. Well, who was here then? It was the Puritans. It was the early settlers. It was the founders, forefathers. And they were set up specifically to teach young men, how to be ministers of the gospel. So and that's your big Ivy League schools now. That's their history. And that's where a lot of these guys had went. Samuel Adams, he was a signer of the Declaration. All right, you probably don't know this, but the Declaration of Independence wasn't really signed or done on July the 4th. It was approved on July the 2nd. That's when everybody said, yeah, we vote to send a declaration and declare our own independence. July 4th, they approved Thomas Jefferson's draft, and they said, this is the draft that we'll send to him. And he didn't write it 100% by himself either, but most of it he did. That was July the 4th, and I don't remember who, but I believe 2 signers signed it that day, and the rest of the Continental Congress didn't get together to look it over and sign it until August the 2nd. So that's actually the day, next time you look at a copy of everything, that's actually the day that all those signatures were placed on there. And Samuel Adams, where the Continental Congress met on August 1st, the day before it, Samuel Adams gave a speech. I got a part of it right here. I want to read real quick. There it is. Called American Independence. And about halfway down, he talks about how our forefathers, which their forefathers would have been over in England, the people who fought tyranny amongst the Catholic Church, he said, our forefathers have thrown off the popery of religion, like the Pope and all that. He said, let this generation now throw off the popery of the political popery, overbearing civil government. They threw off an overbearing Catholic Church, and now we had the opposite. We had a strictly, in the political realm, a popery, a tyrant. He said, this day on the steps of the place where they signed it the day before. He said, "This day I trust the reign of political Protestantism will commence or begin." You know, Protestant was those who fought against the Catholic Church, so now he's calling for political Protestants. Let's be political Protestants. Protestant comes from protest, so let's protest. I pray that political Protestantism will commence. We have explored the temple of royalty and found that the idol we have bowed down to, King George, has eyes which see not, ears which hear not our prayers, and a heart like the nether millstone, the hard heart. We have this day restored the sovereign. Capital S. They restored, they put God back on his throne. Now God never comes off of his throne, but he was saying they were throwing off that natural king, that evil king, and God was going to be the head of those colonies in government. Once again, we have restored the sovereign. So by signing the Declaration of Independence, we were putting God at the head of our government, to whom alone men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven, and with a propitious eye beholds his subjects, assuming that freedom of thought and dignity of self-direction which he bestowed on them. From the rising to the setting sun, may his kingdom come. And that was one of the founders of the Declaration of Independence, signers of the Declaration of Independence, later a governor of Massachusetts, who said that the day before to a group of people, saying this is what signing the Declaration means. So we restored God. We threw off the natural king and set God at the head of our government. There was a famous saying back during that time too, by the way. It said it was no king but King Jesus. That's what a lot of people said. Now, I've mentioned this before in other places, but why is it that we're so against a king, yet we worship a king? What's the main difference in King Jesus and a natural king? Human, right. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Jesus is incorruptible seed, and we're corruptible seed. A man can't handle that much power. That's why a monarchy is a horrible form of government, when you put a man in that control. Jesus will never abuse that power. So that's why we're against a monarchy, but we have a king at the head of our system of government still, just not a man king. Going back to John Locke, I said a minute ago he wrote 2 treatises of civil government. Richard Henry Lee, he was a signer from Virginia. He's the one that made the proposal in Congress that we separate. He claimed that the Declaration was written word for word from John Locke's 2 treatises of civil government. Now, it wasn't actually written word for word. He just meant you could look through and see so many parallels, and a lot of the founders were very familiar with that book. That book alone references the Bible 1,500 times. It's a book about government, the way government should run. It references the Bible 1,500 times. And there you got the signer who said, who made the proposal that we separate, the one that stood up and said it, blatantly said it. He's the one saying, yeah, we pretty much copied that book as our Declaration of Independence. So how would there be no biblical influence in the Declaration of Independence? How would biblical principles not be in there? John Weiss, Travis talked about him the other day. He was a pastor who he was a little bit before the founding era. He's the one that a young guy challenged him to wrestle, and John Weiss, he really didn't want to. He was getting older, but he finally provoked him to do it, so he wrestled him and threw him over the fence, and the young guy said, "All right, Mr. Weiss, I'll be on my way if you'll just throw my horse to me." I don't know if y'all remember that one, but this John Weiss, he had already, in the late 1600s, they had been preaching this stuff for a while, but in the late 1600s, he had already shown out of the Bible where taxation without representation was not biblical. Consent of the governed is the basis of civil government, and all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain rights. Where do we hear that language? Right in the Declaration of Independence. And President Calvin Coolidge, it's interesting, talking about John Weiss, on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which would have been 1926, which is when Calvin Coolidge was president. He was the acting president. At Independence Hall in Philadelphia, he gave a speech about the Declaration of Independence, and he took some of John Weiss's sermons that were a condensed set of sermons that were on those topics that are in the Declaration, and he was giving a speech, and he would read a couple parts out of the Declaration of Independence, and then he'd read the parallel out of John Weiss's sermons, showing where these principles came out of a sermon. That was an active president that stood on that day at Independence Hall in Philadelphia making those parallels. So we really understood this stuff in our country for a long, long time. That was the main thing I was going to say about the Declaration of Independence. I'll go ahead and talk about the Northwest Ordinance real quick. There's not a whole lot on it, but I didn't realize that it actually came before the Constitution, a few months before the Constitution, and it's basically a long list of a lot of practical things, how we admit new territories and new states into the Union, and how many people they have to have before they get a representative in Congress and stuff like that. And I'm going to read a short part. It's got 4 articles in it, or 6 articles, and there's a little bit of writing before it, and this is one of the paragraphs that says, "And for extending the fundamental principles of civil and religious liberty, which form the basis whereon these republics, their laws, and the constitutions are erected." That's these territories, these little republics. That's what we are. We're a collection of small republics. Our states are. Says that the fundamental principles of civil and religious liberty are what forms the basis for these republics. To fix and establish those principles as the basis of all laws, constitutions, and governments which forever hereafter shall be formed in the said territory. I just thought that was that was very telling. And Article 3, talking about education, it says, "Religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged." So it proclaims in one of our 4 organic documents that our whole system of government is built on. It proclaims that religion, morality, and knowledge are necessary to good government and happiness of mankind, and that schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. What do you think they were going to be teaching in those schools? Religion, morality, and knowledge. Because Abraham Lincoln said the philosophy of the classroom in one generation is the philosophy of government in the next. Well, if that's necessary for good government, then they'll be teaching it in the classroom the generation before. There's so many lies that's being spread about our founders these days. They want you to think that they were just heathens and greedy and selfish people and not Christian and everything. And in that exact same article, I've never read anything like this in any of the documents, but I just wanted to share it since we're right here at it. You've heard that, we took the Indians' land and all that and drove them off and separated families and Trail of Tears and all this kinds of stuff. How about this? This is all prerequisites for these new territories. It's stuff that they can and can't do in order to become a member of our new union under our Constitution. It says, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians." Does that sound like racist people who just want to go and gobble up land and at the carnage of men, women, and children? "Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in their property, rights, and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them." So just remember that. That was couldn't have any Indian killers coming into the Union. I mean, that's the way our founders. This was 2 months before the Constitution. This is pretty much the same people that wrote the Constitution. That's the way they felt toward Indians. the last grievance in the Declaration of Independence, one of the things they grieve King George about is that they said that, you've incited insurrections amongst us, and you have encouraged the inhabitants of the frontier, which is the Indian. It says those merciless Indian savages who the only warfare they know of does not distinguish between age, sex, or condition. So we acknowledge that they were savages and they had a very brutal style of warfare, but we still didn't go drive them off. I believe that in the years to come, some of the Indian removal stuff was because Indians, that's the way they were. And out of the two, it was them who couldn't coexist with us. We gave it a chance. And there were plenty of times that Congress actually sent funds to help evangelize to the Indians. So, that's just another lie that we hear in history, But anyways, even knowing that, we still said we're going to show them the utmost good faith and always be observed toward the Indians, and their lands shall not be taken from them. And also, one more thing that you hear about the founders. Article number 6. That was Article 3. This is Article 6. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory. So they weren't taking in a state or a territory that was going to have slavery. The ones that already had slavery, that was put there by the British, that was something that was going to have to phase out or be handled at a different time. But as far as new territories coming into the Union, you could not come in as a slave territory. That was the writers of the Constitution. That was that original founding document. A lot of people think that Abraham Lincoln had to come in and save the day 80 years later. That's just not the case. I guess what I want to go over the Constitution is, since our laws were, a lot of the principles from the Bible went into our Constitution, which has caused its stability and why it was such a unique document that had never been tried before anywhere. Let me point this out. There's a lot of people who say that our Constitution is totally godless and secular and everything. This is interesting to note. David Barton, in one of his videos, one of his series, he holds up a book, which is a pretty popular book. Not that a whole lot of people have read it and really promote it, but it was a legitimate book because it had 2 PhDs and all that who wrote it and blah, blah, blah. It's called The Godless Constitution, okay? And keep in mind that 2 PhDs wrote it. They're the ones who should know, if it's secular and all that kind of stuff. And if there's some silly religious people trying to say that it was a religious document, they would be the ones to, scholarly, prove that was just not the case through research and all that. In the very back, most books have footnotes with sources, especially on something like that, sources that prove over and over and over why they're writing this. Okay? In the back of this book, those 2 PhDs had a little paragraph about this long, and it said, "We have dispensed with the usual scholarly apparatus of footnotes." Basically, everybody knows it's godless. We don't have to prove it, right? And you got David Barton, who has the book that's the opposite of that, called Original Intent, 1,500 footnotes, proving that it's a godly document. Then you got the brains over here, no, you don't need to, everybody knows, right? Trust us, we're PhDs. And that attitude, and a lot of people have. A lot of people have trusted actual doctors because they're PhDs, psychiatrists because they're PhDs. In education, we trust too many people because they're PhDs. And rather than reading it ourselves, it really hadn't been a hard study. And there's so many people who, they'll take that book and they'll try to make a case with it and ignore the fact that they have no footnotes, no proof, none whatsoever. So that right there should tell you that, if they couldn't present anything, good chance it's a godly document. Let me just take a couple of the main articles in the Constitution real quick and just show where they came from the Bible real quick. We get our 3 branches of government. This is one of my favorites. Our idea for 3 branches of government If you've ever looked at Isaiah 33 in verse 22. Brother Richard, you want to read that?
For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us.
You see our three branches of government in that? The king is the executive, the lawgiver is the legislative, and the judge is the judicial. I really like that verse. I'm going to look through a couple of others. The separation of powers, the idea of three separate branches that splits up the power. The king has a centralized all the power in one spot. We separate powers based on Jeremiah 17:9. Brother Billy, could you recite that one?
No, but I'll read it.
Okay.
Scripture says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?
Every individual has a desperately wicked heart. And the more of a Christian you are, the more that heart is brought under control. And people who aren't Christians, a lot of times you see that wickedness. And you see the wickedness in all of us from time to time. That's where that battle is. It's with our heart many times. You give all that power to somebody who has a heart that's desperately wicked, it'll lust after that power, and that's what you have with kings. So that verse right there should explain why a monarchy, kings abuse their power so much. And then you got an oligarchy, which is where a few people have all the power, and that's not good either. That's what our Supreme Court has been in recent years, and that's not good either, is it? It needs to be more. The more decentralized it is, the better. One or two more. Exodus 18:21. If you've ever wondered where we get our Republican form of government, it's when we elect people at the local, the county, the state, and federal levels. That's not by mistake. I'm going to read Exodus 18:21. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth. Should we elect Christians? Hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. You see how you elect people over a small population, then a larger population, and then ultimately like a president or something like that. That's where we get our Republican form of government from. Tax exemption from churches. Ezra 7:24. If the government ever takes away our tax exempt status, is that constitutional or unconstitutional? Unconstitutional. Is it biblical or unbiblical? Unbiblical. Ezra 7:24. Also we certify you that touching any of the priests and Levites, singers, porters, Nethinims, or ministers of this house of God, it shall not be lawful to impose toll, tribute, custom upon them. The Levites were the priests. That's where we get our tax exempt status from. And I'm going to go to two more real quick. The president being a natural born citizen. Even some of what seems like smaller things. President is a natural born citizen, Article 2, Section 1, Deuteronomy 17:15. Deuteronomy 17, that's where the last two will be, if you wanted to turn there. Deuteronomy 17:15. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose, one from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. That's why you have to be a natural born citizen. And then in Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, back up, witnesses and capital punishment. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. That's Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution. I'm sure there's a lot more. That's just kind of one of the only ones that some of the main ones I wanted to go over. They were pretty self-explanatory. One more thing about the Constitution. When you compare it to the constitutions of the world, we've only had 1 revolution and 1 constitution in our entire history. And 240 years, one constitution. Russia has had 4 constitutions since 1917. Brazil has had 7 since 1822. France has had about 15 since its revolution. So, what makes? I mean, can we put some pieces together and see maybe what makes this one work, ours work, over the other ones? Do you think that the people who writing all the other constitutions, do you think they were? I mean, they could have been godly men, some of them, but do you think their idea of incorporating godly principles into government documents, it wouldn't have been there, you know, because they didn't do it. They had ideas that that exhausted themselves and, you know, ultimately fell apart. And I think that's very telling for our Constitution. And I believe that Brother Billy said this morning that the Constitution was divinely inspired. I believe so too. I believe it's just like, you know, we have a lot of problems and confusion today. It's not that the Constitution is outdated, it's that we've gotten away from the Constitution. And the exact same thing happens when our spiritual life falls apart. It's not that the Bible stopped working, it's that we got away from it. I believe that the Constitution will last just as long as anything else true and universal, like the Bible. There's no, if people say it's a living document, those are people who want to destroy it. It's not a living document. It works, and I'll say it is a living document in the sense that it's just as applicable today as it was back then. The writers are dead, but the words live on. And so anyways, and just one more as far as who the God of our society is, and who was really moving in all of our founding documents and up through the years. In 1892, the Supreme Court, they did a thorough review of American history, and they cited about 60 different historical precedences in the courts. And that's what courts constantly do. They look back on precedents and see what was done beforehand. And they said that there is no dissonance in these declarations. There is a universal language pervading them all, having one meaning. They affirm and reaffirm that this is a religious nation. This is a Christian nation. And that was what your Supreme Court said over 100 years after the founders were gone. So I hope that you continue to look into some of this. And if you have any questions, I'd love to share more. We all 3 had to kind of scale back on some of the stuff that we shared, you know. But that's all I had.